Welcome to the Cozy Storytime, your peaceful space to unwind and relax. Before we start, make sure to subscribe and like the video for more cozy stories every night. Now, take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's drift into a peaceful slumber together. This time I will tell you about the Frog Prince. In a kingdom nestled in the lush green hills, surrounded by beautiful forests and shimmering lakes, there was a magnificent castle. The castle stood tall with its sparkling towers, golden gates, and intricate carvings on every wall. Its grounds were a sprawling garden of vibrant flowers, well-kept hedges, and meandering pathways that led to serene ponds and bubbling streams. It was a place of elegance and beauty, where the sun always seemed to shine a little brighter, and the air smelled of blooming flowers and fresh earth. This was where the story of the princess and the golden ball would unfold. The princess who lived in the castle was known throughout the kingdom for her beauty, grace, and kindness. Her golden hair cascaded like a river of light, her eyes sparkled with the innocence of youth, and her smile could brighten even the darkest of days. She was the apple of her father's eye, the king, and loved by everyone in the kingdom. She was gentle and kind-hearted, always willing to help those in need, whether it was assisting her mother, the queen, in the royal gardens or helping the village children with their studies. However, despite all the love and admiration that surrounded her, the princess had one particular passion that no one could take away from her: playing with her golden ball. This golden ball was no ordinary toy. It was a beautifully crafted sphere, its surface gleaming in the sunlight like a tiny sun, and it sparkled with a magical allure. The ball was a gift from her late grandmother, who had told her that it was a symbol of fortune and happiness. It was the princess's most cherished possession, and she took it everywhere with her. On sunny days, you could often find her alone by the tranquil pond near the castle, tossing the golden ball high into the air, watching it sparkle against the blue sky, and catching it as it fell gently back into her hands. The pond was a peaceful place, where the soft rustling of the trees and the gentle lapping of the water on the shore provided the perfect background for the princess's solitude. It was the one place where she could escape the pressures of royal duties and lose herself in the simplicity of her favorite game. There, by the edge of the water, she felt free and at peace, surrounded by the quiet beauty of nature. On one such day, the princess found herself at the pond once more, her golden ball clutched tightly in her hands. The sun was shining, birds were singing in the trees, and the world seemed perfect. She threw the ball high into the air, watching it sparkle as it floated effortlessly above her head. But just as she reached to catch it, her hand slipped, and the ball flew too far. It soared high above her head, and before she could react, it landed with a soft splash into the pond. The princess gasped in horror. The golden ball sank into the water, disappearing beneath the surface. Panic surged through her chest. She could not imagine losing her precious ball, her only source of joy and comfort. She knelt at the water's edge, desperately looking for any sign of the ball, but the pond's clear waters had already swallowed it whole. She could see nothing but the faint ripples left by her ball's descent. Her heart sank. She reached out as far as she could, stretching her arms, but the water was too deep. She stood up and walked along the edge of the pond, her footsteps slow and deliberate, as if hoping the ball would somehow appear before her eyes. But it didn't. She looked around, hoping someone would come to her aid, but the area was empty. The surrounding trees, tall and sturdy, seemed to stand silent as if they too were mourning the loss of the golden ball. The princess was alone, her golden treasure now lost to the depths of the water. She sat down on a rock near the water's edge, tears welling in her eyes. She had lost something irreplaceable. Her grandmother's gift was now gone, and there was no way to get it back. The princess wiped away the tears that had begun to fall from her eyes. She sniffled, trying to regain her composure, but the sadness inside her was overwhelming. She had never felt so alone. Her heart felt heavy, and the day, which had started so wonderfully, now seemed to stretch on endlessly, filled with sorrow and regret. As she sat there, lost in her thoughts, something strange happened. A soft voice broke through the stillness of the moment. "Why do you weep, princess?" the voice asked. The princess looked around in confusion, her eyes wide with surprise. Who could be speaking to her? She glanced at the pond and noticed something odd. There, floating calmly on the water's surface, was a small frog. It was sitting on a lily pad, its round, bulging eyes fixed on her with an expression that seemed almost wise. The frog spoke again, its voice gentle and soothing. "I see you are troubled. Is there something I can help with?" The princess blinked, unsure if she had heard the frog correctly. She had never heard an animal speak before. She had never heard of a frog that could talk. Yet there it was, sitting on its lily pad, looking at her with an air of quiet understanding. I lost my golden ball," the princess explained, her voice shaky. "It sank into the pond, and I can't find it." The frog tilted its head to one side, its large eyes watching her closely. "I can help you retrieve it," the frog said calmly. "But there is something you must promise me in return." The princess, still caught in the sorrow of her loss, barely registered the frog's words. She wasn't sure what kind of help a frog could offer, but the idea of retrieving her beloved golden ball was too tempting to resist. Without thinking, she nodded. "Anything," she said, her voice desperate. "I'll do anything to get it back." The frog smiled in its own way, a small, knowing smile. "Very well," it said. "Promise me this. When I retrieve the golden ball, you will take me into your castle. You will allow me to live with you, share your meals, and be your companion." The princess stared at the frog, momentarily stunned. "Live with me? But you're just a frog," she exclaimed. "How could I possibly let a frog live in my castle?" The frog's expression remained unchanged, calm and serene. "That is the promise I ask of you. Will you agree to it?" Without truly considering the weight of her words, the princess, still consumed by the hope of getting her ball back, nodded eagerly. "I promise. Now, please, bring back my ball." The frog gave a small, satisfied nod and dived into the pond. The princess watched as it disappeared beneath the surface, holding her breath in anticipation. Her heart pounded as she hoped the frog would keep its word. Would it really return her golden ball? And what would she do when it did? Would she have to honor the promise she made, even though it seemed impossible? In the stillness of the pond, only time would tell. The princess watched anxiously as the frog disappeared beneath the surface of the pond, the ripples spreading outward like 1,000 tiny whispers. She stood there for a moment, still clutching the edge of her dress, her eyes fixed on the water where the frog had gone. The air felt heavy, almost expectant. She could hear the faint sound of birds chirping in the distance, the wind rustling through the trees, but everything else seemed to fade into silence as she waited. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours, and the princess began to doubt the frog's words. Had she made a mistake? Had she been too hasty in agreeing to the strange request of a talking frog? Her heart fluttered with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. What if the frog was just toying with her, offering false promises with no intention of helping her at all? But then, just as doubt began to creep into her thoughts, the water stirred once again. The princess's breath caught in her throat as the frog resurfaced, holding the golden ball gently in its mouth. The ball gleamed even brighter in the frog's possession, almost as if it had absorbed the light from the water around it. It floated toward the princess with a calm elegance, the frog paddling gracefully through the water, the golden ball balanced carefully on its small mouth. The princess's eyes widened in astonishment as the frog made its way toward her. She had been so focused on the thought of losing the ball that she had nearly forgotten about the promise she had made. But now, standing before her, the frog had delivered on its part of the bargain. The ball was back in her possession. Without a word, the frog gently placed the golden ball on the shore, its soft, webbed feet stepping carefully onto the grass. It looked up at the princess, waiting for a response, its eyes as calm and unblinking as before. The princess, her heart racing, bent down to pick up the ball, feeling the smoothness of the golden surface in her hands once again. She held it up, staring at its shining surface, and for a brief moment, she forgot everything else. She felt a rush of joy, of relief, as if the weight of the world had been lifted from her shoulders. But as she stood there, holding her precious ball, a faint reminder of the frog's promise echoed in her mind. Her joy was fleeting as the memory of her words returned. She had made a promise to take the frog into her castle, to share her home with it as a companion. She had agreed without much thought, too focused on the immediate need to get her ball back. Now, standing in the quiet of the moment, she realized the gravity of her promise. The princess glanced down at the frog, who was still waiting patiently by the shore, watching her with those unblinking eyes. The frog had fulfilled its part of the bargain, and now it was her turn to do the same. She could feel the weight of her decision pressing upon her, and a small wave of uncertainty washed over her. How could she invite a frog into her castle? How could she allow it to sit at the royal table and share her meals? The very thought seemed absurd. A frog in the palace? It was unthinkable. The princess shifted uncomfortably, her fingers gripping the golden ball a little tighter. She looked away from the frog, her mind racing for a way out of the situation. Surely, there must be another way. She had been so hasty, so caught up in the desperation of losing the ball that she hadn't considered the consequences of making such an unusual promise. She couldn't possibly follow through with it, could she? Yet, as she stood there, looking at the frog, she could see something in its eyes, something calm, something knowing, as if it understood the turmoil she was experiencing. The frog wasn't demanding anything of her. It wasn't showing anger or frustration. It was simply waiting, patient and understanding. It had done what it had promised to do, and now it was waiting for her to honor her word. The princess felt a deep, inexplicable sense of guilt. She had made a promise, and promises, no matter how strange or difficult, were meant to be kept. Her heart tugged at her conscience, reminding her of the importance of honesty and integrity, even when no one else was watching. She had agreed to this strange bargain, and now she had to follow through, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. With a sigh, the princess knelt down to the frog, her golden ball still clutched tightly in her hands. She looked into its eyes, her voice soft but firm. "I made a promise," she said, her words carrying the weight of sincerity. "I promised to take you to the castle, to allow you to live with me as my companion." She paused for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision on her shoulders. "And I will keep my word." The frog blinked slowly, as if acknowledging her words, but there was no joy, no celebration in its expression. It simply nodded in its quiet way, its gaze never leaving the princess. "Thank you," the frog said, its voice soft and steady. "I shall hold you to your promise." The princess rose to her feet, still holding the golden ball in one hand. She stared down at the frog, feeling a mix of hesitation and resolve. She knew what she had to do, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change in ways she hadn't anticipated. "Come with me," the princess said, her voice now more certain than before. "I will take you to the castle." The frog gave another slow nod, then began to hop toward the path that led to the castle. Its small, steady leaps were almost rhythmic, the soft rustling of its webbed feet on the grass blending with the sounds of the wind in the trees. The princess followed behind, holding her ball in one hand, her heart still racing with the thought of what was to come. She was unsure of what the future held, but one thing was certain: she was about to begin a journey she had never expected. As they walked together toward the castle, the princess couldn't help but wonder what kind of companion the frog would turn out to be. What would it be like to have a frog as a part of her daily life? Could she truly live with it, sit at the table with it, and treat it as an equal? She didn't know, but one thing was clear: her life was about to take an unexpected turn. Whether for better or worse, only time would tell. The path to the castle seemed much longer than it had before, or perhaps it was just that the princess's mind was filled with a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more unsettling than the last. With every step, her heart seemed to pound louder, echoing the unease in her chest. She had agreed to let the frog into her castle, but now that the moment was upon her, the reality of it all was beginning to sink in. The princess couldn't help but wonder if she had made the right choice. She glanced down at the small, determined frog hopping steadily along beside her. It moved with a sort of quiet confidence, its small legs pushing through the grass with ease. Despite its calm demeanor, the princess couldn't shake the strange sensation that bubbled up inside her. The frog, after all, was still a frog. It didn't belong in the palace, with its fine tapestries and royal decor. It didn't belong at the royal table, eating the delicate dishes prepared by the finest chefs. What would the other members of the court say? What would her father, the king, think? Would they laugh at her for making such a strange and, frankly, absurd promise? As they walked along the path, the princess's mind was filled with questions, and each one only made her more uncertain. She had always been a dutiful daughter, obedient to the will of her father, the king, and she had never once questioned her royal responsibilities. But this felt different. A frog in the castle? It seemed so out of place, so out of character for a royal household. And yet, as she glanced down at the frog, she couldn't deny the quiet wisdom in its eyes. There was something almost regal about the way it carried itself, something dignified in its presence. Despite its appearance, the frog had helped her when no one else could. It had kept its promise, retrieving her golden ball without hesitation or complaint. In a strange way, the princess realized the frog had proven itself more reliable than many of the humans in her life. It had done exactly what it had promised to do, and now it was waiting for her to keep her word. But still, the princess hesitated. The castle loomed in the distance, its grand spires rising against the horizon, and the princess felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She thought about the royal court, the elegant guests who frequented the palace, and the dignitaries who came from far and wide. What would they say if they saw the princess walking into the palace with a frog by her side? How could she explain it? How could she justify the absurdity of it all? The princess had always prided herself on maintaining the dignity of her position, and now she feared that this strange promise would shatter that dignity. She could almost hear the whispers of the courtiers in her mind. The princess has lost her mind. What is she thinking, bringing a frog into the palace? How could she disgrace the royal family like this? The fear of public ridicule began to grow within her, feeding on her doubts and insecurities. And yet, in the back of her mind, she knew that the whispers didn't matter. What mattered was her word, and she had given it. As they approached the castle gates, the princess slowed her pace, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision she had made. She could see the guards standing at attention, their armor gleaming in the sunlight, and she wondered if they would laugh at the sight of a frog hopping toward them. Would they bow to it? Would they allow it into the castle? Would they even take her seriously? She wasn't sure, but she knew she had no choice now. She had made a promise, and the time had come to fulfill it. The frog hopped ahead of her, its small feet making soft, rhythmic sounds on the cobblestones as it moved toward the entrance. The princess hesitated for a moment longer, taking a deep breath, and then followed behind, her steps slow and deliberate. She couldn't turn back now, no matter how strange or uncomfortable this situation seemed. She had agreed, and now she would keep her word. As they reached the castle gates, the guards looked down at the frog with raised eyebrows. They said nothing, but their puzzled expressions were enough to make the princess feel self-conscious. She tried to ignore the growing discomfort in her chest, forcing herself to remain calm and composed, just as she had been taught to do. She was the princess. She had made a promise. She had to follow through. The frog, seemingly unaware of the growing tension around it, hopped past the guards with ease. The princess followed closely behind, her mind still racing with questions and doubts. What would her father say? How would he react to this strange new companion? The thought of having to explain it to him made her stomach churn. She had always been his pride and joy, the daughter he adored, and the idea of disappointing him, of making him angry or embarrassed, filled her with dread. But she couldn't back out now. Her promise was a matter of integrity, and her word was something that could not be taken lightly. As much as she feared the unknown, she knew that her character was at stake. She had always valued honesty and trust, and she couldn't betray those principles now, no matter how uncomfortable the situation was. With a deep breath, the princess entered the grand halls of the castle. The long corridors stretched before her, their stone walls lined with tapestries depicting the kingdom's rich history. The floor beneath her feet was polished to a shine, the reflections of the chandeliers above dancing on the surface. Everything in the castle was designed to exude royalty, elegance, and refinement. And yet, the thought of the frog in this setting felt completely out of place. She moved cautiously, the frog still hopping along ahead of her, its small legs making soft sounds on the marble floors. She could hear the faint echo of the frog's movement as it passed through the grand halls, and each sound seemed to amplify her growing discomfort. She had never felt so out of place in her own home. The castle, which had always been a sanctuary of peace and grandeur, now seemed to mock her with its opulence. How could she reconcile the regal beauty of the castle with the absurdity of having a frog within its walls? As they made their way toward the dining hall, the princess's anxiety reached its peak. She was about to present this frog to her father, the king, who had never once been anything but strict and formal. He was a man of tradition and dignity, a ruler who upheld the values of the kingdom with unwavering resolve. How would he respond to this strange request? How would he feel about her promise, about her decision to bring this frog into their home? The princess didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing for certain: the time for hesitation was over. She had made a promise, and now it was time to face the consequences. The princess walked through the grand halls of the castle with a mixture of apprehension and resolve, the soft sound of the frog's hopping growing more pronounced with each step. She had promised to let the frog into the palace, and now there was no turning back. Her father, the king, would be waiting for her in the royal chambers, no doubt expecting a calm and peaceful evening. Little did he know that his daughter, the princess, was about to introduce the most unexpected of guests. The castle's grand dining hall loomed before her, its doors wide open, a gentle warmth emanating from the flickering torches along the walls. Inside, the long wooden table was set, the silverware gleaming softly in the warm light. It was the height of royal elegance, exactly the kind of setting where a frog, especially one that had just been pulled from a pond, would seem completely out of place. But as the princess stepped into the room, she steeled herself for what was to come. Her promise to the frog had brought her to this moment, and now she had to face the consequences, whatever they might be. The king was seated at the head of the table, as regal as ever. His graying hair was neatly combed, his crown resting firmly on his head, and his eyes glimmered with wisdom as he looked over the royal documents placed before him. The moment the princess entered, he looked up and smiled warmly, his deep voice resonating through the chamber. "Ah, my daughter," he said kindly, "you're home. I trust your day went well?" The princess, her heart racing, nodded. "Yes, father. My day was eventful." The king raised an eyebrow, clearly noticing her unease. "Eventful, you say? What has happened, my dear?" The princess hesitated for a moment, and then, with a deep breath, she motioned toward the door. I have someone to introduce to you, father." The king's brow furrowed. "Someone? Who is it?" At that moment, the frog hopped through the open door behind her, its small feet making soft thuds on the marble floor. The princess glanced over her shoulder, her face flushed with both nervousness and determination. She could already hear the rustle of anticipation in the air as the frog made its way into the dining hall, its eyes fixed on her father with the same quiet calm it had shown since their first meeting. The frog didn't look out of place to him, but to the princess, it felt like everything was out of balance, like the world had tilted on its axis. The king's gaze shifted from the princess to the frog, and he blinked in surprise. He wasn't sure if he was seeing things clearly, or if his daughter had lost her senses. A frog, this small, insignificant creature, was now standing in his royal dining room, its eyes glinting like two small jewels, watching him as though expecting to be greeted with the same respect as the queen or any other noble. "Father," the princess said, her voice a little shaky, "this is the frog." The king remained silent for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he studied the creature. The frog, seemingly oblivious to the tension in the room, hopped forward with a deliberate, slow movement until it stood directly in front of the king, its tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. It had the calm demeanor of a creature who knew exactly what it was doing, as though this were simply part of its plan. The king, ever the stoic ruler, finally spoke, his voice steady but tinged with disbelief. "A frog?" he asked. "You've brought a frog into the royal dining hall? Do you expect me to treat this creature as a guest?" The princess swallowed hard. She had known her father would react this way, but hearing the disbelief in his voice still stung. "Father," she said, trying to keep her voice calm, "I made a promise. The frog helped me when no one else could. It retrieved my golden ball from the pond after it had fallen into the water. I agreed to take it into the palace as my companion, and I must keep my word." The king's expression softened slightly as he regarded his daughter. He had raised her to be honest, to uphold her word, and he knew that, despite how strange it seemed, she was simply doing what she felt was right. But still, a frog? A talking frog? He had trouble wrapping his mind around it. "You're telling me that this creature," he gestured toward the frog, "was the one who returned your golden ball?" "Yes," the princess replied, nodding firmly. "It was the frog." The king sat in stunned silence for a moment, as if trying to absorb the absurdity of the situation. But as he looked at his daughter, he could see the sincerity in her eyes, the unwavering commitment to keeping her promise. And so, after a long pause, he sighed deeply and leaned back in his chair. "Well then," the king said, with a slight chuckle in his voice, "if you have made a promise, then it must be kept. A royal promise cannot be broken, no matter how strange it may seem." He paused and then turned his attention back to the frog, his expression thoughtful. "Very well, you may stay. But I must warn you," he said with a wink, "you will need to follow the rules of the court just like any other guest. If you are to dine with us, I expect you to behave properly." The frog, who had been quietly observing the exchange, gave a small hop, as if acknowledging the king's words. It made no sound, but its eyes gleamed with an understanding that only added to the mystery of its true nature. The princess, relieved that her father had accepted the frog's presence, however reluctantly, smiled gratefully. "Thank you, father. You're very kind." The king nodded, his face softening into a smile. "Kindness, my dear, is not always easy to come by. But if you've learned anything from this little frog, it's that promises are powerful things. They shape our destiny." The frog hopped once more, as though in agreement, before making its way toward the seat at the end of the table. It climbed up onto the chair with an ease that belied its small size, and settled down, its eyes still fixed on the royal family. The king chuckled softly and turned to his daughter. "Your frog may be strange, but it certainly knows how to make an entrance," he said, a mischievous twinkle in his eye. "Now, let's see if it has the manners to eat properly." The princess laughed lightly, the tension in her chest easing slightly. For the first time, she felt as though her decision to keep her promise was truly the right one. No matter how absurd the situation seemed, it was a reminder that she had chosen to honor her word, no matter the cost. And in the end, that was what mattered most. The following days at the castle unfolded in a quiet yet strange manner. The princess had hoped that perhaps the frog's time in the palace would be short-lived, but it turned out that the frog, having kept its promise and having been granted its place, was not about to leave so easily. Despite the initial awkwardness and disbelief from the royal court, the frog began to establish its presence within the palace walls with a quiet persistence. At first, the courtiers and servants looked at the frog with confusion, whispers following it wherever it hopped. It was truly a strange sight, a talking frog, no less, sitting at the royal table, eating with silver utensils. It certainly was not something any of them had seen before, and there were moments of uncomfortable silence when the frog would hop up beside the princess at meals, its small eyes staring attentively at the plates before them. The servants, too, would glance nervously at each other, unsure of how to treat a frog that ate with royalty. However, to everyone's surprise, the frog didn't cause any trouble. It was calm, composed, and, though it was small in size, its presence in the dining hall grew less and less strange as time passed. The frog, it seemed, had an understanding of palace etiquette that no one could have expected. It never made a mess, never overstepped its boundaries. It sat quietly beside the princess, watching her carefully as she dined, occasionally nibbling at its own food with tiny, measured bites. The princess herself couldn't quite decide what to make of the situation. On one hand, she had kept her word, and that gave her a sense of peace. On the other hand, living with the frog in the palace, seeing it at her side every day, sitting at her table, accompanying her through the royal halls, was certainly a constant reminder of the strange promise she had made. It was something she had never imagined would become part of her life. One evening, as the princess sat in the royal garden, the frog joined her, perching on a stone beside her. The sun was setting, casting a soft golden glow over the palace grounds. The garden was calm, the flowers swaying gently in the breeze, the sound of a distant fountain filling the air. The princess, in an effort to break the silence that always seemed to hang in the air when they were together, turned to the frog. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice soft and curious. She had been wondering this for days. "Why did you promise to get my ball back? Why didn't you just let me struggle?" The frog tilted its head, its large eyes glimmering with an understanding that seemed almost wise beyond words. "Because you needed help," it said simply. Its voice was steady, calm, and gentle, as though it had said this 1,000 times. "Everyone needs help at some point in their lives, princess. And when you asked for help, I gave it. No promise was too great for me to keep, because your heart was pure." The princess blinked, surprised by the depth of the frog's response. She had expected some grand explanation or a witty remark, but instead, the frog had given her something simple, something truthful. It was the kind of wisdom that you didn't often hear in the royal courts, where everything was clothed in formality and expectation. She paused, considering the frog's words, and for the first time, she realized that there was more to this creature than met the eye. "You say that I have a pure heart," she said slowly, turning her gaze toward the setting sun, "but why do you help me when others might not? Why would a frog care for the princess of a kingdom?" The frog looked at her steadily, its eyes softening with something that could have been affection, or perhaps just understanding. "Because," it replied, "we are all capable of kindness. And kindness is not bound by form or shape. It comes from the heart, and your heart, princess, is kind." The princess felt a warmth in her chest at the frog's words, and for a moment, the discomfort she had felt about its presence in the palace seemed to fade. There was something about the frog's quiet wisdom that put her at ease, something about its simplicity that contrasted the grandiosity of the palace. It made her realize that perhaps she had been so focused on the expectations of others, the court, the king, and herself, that she had forgotten the true value of kindness and understanding. The frog's stay in the castle wasn't just about keeping a promise. It was teaching her lessons she had never anticipated. Despite its appearance, it was showing her that kindness didn't need to be complicated or grand. It was something simple, something that could be shared between two unlikely companions. The days that followed were filled with more quiet conversations like that one. The princess began to look forward to her moments with the frog, the moments when she could simply sit and talk, and let her mind wander beyond the concerns of royal life. She found herself seeking out the frog's company more often, whether it was in the garden or beside the palace fountain. It seemed that the frog, though strange and unexpected, had a calming effect on her, one that the court and her family could never provide. Over time, the other members of the royal family began to take notice of the frog's presence. The queen, although skeptical at first, grew fond of the creature, particularly after seeing how it never caused any disruption and seemed to bring an air of calm to the princess. Even the courtiers, who had once looked at the frog with suspicion, began to soften their attitudes toward it. They began to respect it for what it was, a being who had kept a promise and shown that there was more to royalty than titles and appearances. It was a reminder that nobility of heart was more important than nobility of blood. However, it wasn't just the royal family who took notice. As the princess spent more time with the frog, she realized that its stay in the castle was beginning to teach her things about herself as well. She had once been so concerned with appearances, with how others would perceive her actions, that she had lost sight of her own values. But the frog's simple wisdom had a way of bringing her back to herself. It had shown her the power of kindness, the importance of keeping promises, and the quiet strength that comes from honoring one's word. As the days passed, the princess found herself less worried about what others thought of the frog's presence in the castle. She had made her promise, and the frog had kept its part. Now, she realized that what truly mattered was not the opinions of others, but the integrity with which she lived her life. No matter how strange this situation seemed, it had brought her closer to a truth she had always known deep inside, that the value of one's word and actions was greater than anything material. As the days turned into weeks, something began to shift within the princess. At first, she had viewed the frog's presence in the palace with mild reluctance, seeing it as a necessary inconvenience. It was a creature she had made a promise to, and fulfilling that promise had, at first, felt like an obligation. But as the days passed, something about the frog's quiet demeanor, its unwavering patience, and its deep wisdom began to change the way she saw the world and herself. It wasn't an overnight transformation. The princess still found moments where she felt awkward, especially when she found herself dining beside the frog in the royal hall. Her courtiers and attendants would occasionally glance over, still trying to come to terms with the unusual guest at the table. But gradually, the strange, uncomfortable feeling started to fade. In its place, something new blossomed, a growing sense of comfort, and eventually, even a bond. One afternoon, the princess sat in the garden once again, the sun warm on her face, a light breeze ruffling the leaves of the trees surrounding her. She was reading a book of poetry that had been a gift from her mother, but her thoughts kept drifting away from the verses. The memory of the frog's words from their earlier conversation echoed in her mind. Kindness is not bound by form or shape. It comes from the heart. Those words resonated with her now in a way they hadn't before. She had been so focused on appearances, on the expectations of others, that she had forgotten how to simply be kind, how to honor the true meaning of promise and loyalty. The frog, who had taken to spending much of its time by the princess's side, hopped quietly to a stone bench near her, its large eyes watching her as she read. She glanced at it and smiled, the usual awkwardness now replaced by a strange sense of warmth. It had become almost natural to have the frog there, sitting silently beside her, sharing her space without ever demanding anything from her. In a way, the frog had become a reminder of something she had once lost, the simplicity of being present in the moment, of not worrying about what others thought, and of accepting things as they were. "Do you ever miss the pond?" the princess asked suddenly, her voice soft, her eyes still on the pages of her book. It was an odd question, and she wasn't sure why she'd asked it. Perhaps it was because she, too, had started to miss the simplicity of her life before the palace, before the weight of royal expectations had shaped everything she did. The frog turned its head toward her, its large eyes glimmering in the sunlight. "I miss the calm of the water," it replied thoughtfully. "But I do not miss the isolation. There is more to life than being alone in the water." The princess looked at the frog, her heart swelling with something she could not yet name. The frog, despite its humble beginnings, had a wisdom that went beyond anything she had ever encountered. It had lived its life alone in the pond, but it didn't dwell on the past, it didn't mourn what was lost. It accepted what came next, even if it was an unexpected stay in a grand castle beside a princess who had once felt uncomfortable with its presence. It was a lesson she had begun to grasp more fully as the days passed. Life wasn't about clinging to what you had lost. It was about embracing the present moment and learning from what it offered. "I think I understand," the princess said quietly. "It's easy to get caught up in the past, to long for what we had before. But there's no going back. All we can do is move forward, even if it feels strange or uncertain." The frog's gaze softened, and it nodded slowly, as if in approval of her realization. "Exactly," it said. "And sometimes, the things that feel strange or uncertain are the very things that can teach us the most." The princess smiled, feeling a gentle warmth spread through her chest. The frog was right. All of this, her promise, its presence in the castle, the strange and unexpected bond they had formed, had taught her something valuable. She had spent so much of her life focused on what was expected of her, on how she was supposed to behave as a princess, on how to live up to the standards of the royal court. But now, for the first time in a long while, she was learning to embrace things as they were, to let go of her worries, and to simply be present. As she sat there in the garden, with the frog by her side, the princess realized that the world was not as rigid as she had once thought. The lines between what was acceptable and what was not were not as clearly defined as they seemed. What mattered most wasn't her status as a princess or her ability to meet others' expectations, it was her ability to stay true to her heart, to honor her promises, and to be kind without concern for appearances. That evening, as the princess sat at the royal table, her usual apprehension was gone. The frog sat beside her, as it always did, but this time she didn't feel uncomfortable. Instead, she felt a sense of peace that came from knowing she was doing what was right. The frog had taught her a great deal, but more than anything, it had reminded her that true nobility wasn't about titles or wealth, it was about the kindness and integrity one held in their heart. The court may have whispered and looked upon the frog with confusion, but the princess knew better. The frog had shown her that there was no need to hide behind appearances. It had come into her life unbidden, and in doing so, had taught her lessons that no one else had been able to provide. It had opened her heart to the simple, powerful truths of life, truths she had once overlooked in favor of status and perfection. As the night drew on and the royal dinner ended, the princess felt something inside her shift. She was no longer the same princess who had first made her promise to the frog. She had changed, grown, and learned. And in that growth, she had discovered a new sense of peace, one that didn't depend on external validation or the approval of others. It was the peace that came from within, from honoring one's word, from living a life of kindness, and from knowing that the things that truly mattered were often the simplest and most unexpected. The days in the castle had taken on a rhythm of their own, a quiet tranquility that seemed to settle over the princess as she continued her daily routine with the frog. Although the court still whispered when the frog appeared, the princess no longer cared. She had come to realize that her promise was more than just a mere obligation. It was a turning point, one that had brought her deeper understanding of herself and the world around her. She had made her peace with it, and in return, she had found a sense of calm that she had never known before. It was on one particularly serene evening that something truly extraordinary happened. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange, pink, and gold. The princess had just finished dinner and was sitting in the royal garden, her favorite place to reflect. The air was cool, the scent of blooming roses filling the air, and the faint sound of the palace fountains offered a peaceful backdrop. The frog, as usual, had joined her, sitting silently by her side. There was a quiet contentment in their companionship, a wordless understanding that needed no explanation. She looked down at the frog, smiling softly to herself. It was hard to imagine that, only a few weeks ago, she had been uncomfortable with its presence. Now, she couldn't imagine the garden without it. As she sat there, lost in her thoughts, a strange energy seemed to fill the air. It was subtle at first, like a soft breeze stirring the leaves of the trees, but soon the princess began to feel it more distinctly. There was a warmth, a tingling sensation that seemed to radiate from the frog sitting beside her. The gentle light of the moon bathed the garden in a silver glow, and the princess felt a strange shift in the atmosphere. Something magical was unfolding, but she couldn't understand what. Suddenly, the frog stirred, its small body quivering slightly as if it was reacting to an unseen force. The princess's heart skipped a beat as she watched it closely, a sense of awe building inside her. The frog began to hop gently on the ground, moving slowly, deliberately, and then it stopped, its eyes locking with hers. The princess held her breath, sensing that something profound was about to happen. Her eyes widened in amazement as she watched the frog begin to change before her very eyes. The transformation was slow, almost imperceptible at first, but gradually, the small creature's form started to shimmer with a soft, golden light. The princess's eyes widened in disbelief as the frog seemed to stretch and grow, its limbs elongating, its features reshaping into something more human. She could hardly believe what she was seeing, and yet, there was no denying the magical transformation unfolding before her. The frog's small, slick body began to morph, its legs growing longer and more graceful, its skin changing from the rough green texture to a smooth, radiant complexion. Its once bulging eyes softened into the clear, striking eyes of a young man. The princess could hardly believe what was happening, her mind struggling to comprehend the sight. Within moments, the frog had disappeared, replaced by a handsome young man standing in front of her, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity. The transformation was complete. The princess blinked in astonishment, her mouth opening slightly in surprise. She had no words, no explanation for what had just occurred. The young man who now stood before her was unlike anyone she had ever met. His appearance was regal, yet he radiated a quiet humility that set him apart from the princes and courtiers she had known. His golden hair shimmered in the moonlight, and his presence filled the garden with a sense of peace that made everything around them seem more vivid, more alive. But what truly struck her were his eyes that held a depth, a wisdom that surpassed his youthful appearance. The young man smiled softly, a gentle, almost knowing smile. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and warm, like the voice of someone who had experienced much, yet carried no bitterness or regret. "Princess," he said, his voice as soothing as a quiet breeze, "it is time for you to know the truth. I am no ordinary frog. I was once a prince, cursed by an enchantress. My form was bound by a spell, and only by finding someone with a truly pure heart could the curse be broken. When you made your promise to me, when you kept your word, it was your kindness and integrity that broke the spell." The princess stood there in stunned silence, her mind racing as she tried to process what she had just heard. A prince? The frog had been a prince all along? It felt like a dream, like something too fantastical to be real. She took a cautious step forward, her eyes searching the young man's face, looking for some sign that this wasn't some illusion. But the look in his eyes, the soft smile on his lips, told her that what he was saying was true. "I never expected you to keep your promise," the young prince continued, his voice tender. "I never thought anyone would be willing to fulfill the terms of such a strange bargain. But you, princess, have shown me the power of a pure heart, a heart that seeks to do what is right, no matter how difficult it may be." The princess stood there, her heart swelling with emotion. The frog she had once viewed as nothing more than a strange, burdensome companion was now a prince who had been trapped in a curse for so long. And it was her kindness, her willingness to keep her promise, that had freed him. She felt a rush of warmth spread through her chest, the realization settling in that this journey she had been on, this promise she had made, had led her to something far greater than she could have imagined. "You were a prince all along," the princess whispered, her voice trembling with wonder. "But why did you choose to stay as a frog? Why did you not reveal yourself to me sooner?" The young prince sighed softly, his gaze shifting to the stars above. "I had to learn the value of keeping promises, of showing kindness even when it's not expected," he said. "And I had to find someone who would see past appearances, who would offer me their heart without hesitation. When I saw you, I knew you were the one who could break the curse, not because of your beauty or your status, but because of the goodness in your heart." The princess felt her heart swell with emotion as she gazed at the young man standing before her. He had been a frog, a creature she had once viewed with suspicion and discomfort, but now he was standing before her as a prince, kind, humble, and wise. In the time they had spent together, she had learned more about herself than she ever could have imagined, and in the end, it had been her own heart, her own willingness to be kind and true to her word, that had set him free. The young prince reached out his hand, and the princess took it, her fingers trembling with the weight of everything that had happened. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice filled with gratitude. "You have given me my freedom, my true form, and the chance to live the life I was meant to live." The princess smiled through the tears that had begun to form in her eyes. "I didn't do it for you," she said quietly. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." And with that simple truth, the princess realized that the greatest transformations didn't come from magic or spells, but from the purity of the heart and the strength of one's character. As the young prince stood before her, his hand still gently holding hers, the princess felt an overwhelming sense of peace. It was as though all the doubts and uncertainties that had plagued her for so long had melted away. The transformation had not only freed the prince from his curse, but it had also freed her from the constraints of appearances, from the pressure to live up to expectations, and from the fear of making choices that might seem strange or out of place. The moonlight bathed the garden in a silvery glow, and the soft rustling of the trees around them seemed to carry a sense of quiet celebration. For the first time in a long while, the princess felt truly at ease. The world no longer seemed like a place filled with rigid rules and expectations. It was a place of endless possibilities, where love, kindness, and the courage to be true to oneself could lead to the most unexpected of outcomes. "You are no longer a frog," the princess said softly, still marveling at the prince before her. "But you're still you. You are kind, and wise, and gentle. You've taught me so much." The prince smiled, his eyes sparkling with gratitude and affection. "And you, princess, have taught me that the truest magic lies not in spells or enchantments, but in the purity of a heart that acts with sincerity and honor." The princess's heart swelled with emotion at his words. She had spent so much of her life seeking approval, trying to meet the expectations of others, but now she understood that the key to happiness and fulfillment was to follow the quiet, steadfast truth that lay within her own heart. The promise she had made to the frog had led her down an unexpected path, but that path had brought her to a place of deep understanding. She had learned that sometimes the most extraordinary transformations happen when we are true to ourselves and act with kindness, even when it feels uncomfortable or strange. The prince took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I've spent so many years trapped in that form, waiting for someone like you to break the curse. I thought I would never find a way out. But then I met you, and I realized that sometimes the answers we seek come from the most unlikely places." The princess nodded, her smile soft and genuine. "And sometimes the greatest lessons we learn come from the most unexpected companions." The two stood there for a moment, their hands still clasped, taking in the quiet beauty of the night around them. It felt as though the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter of their journey to begin. As the night stretched on, the princess and the prince walked side by side back toward the castle, the soft glow of the lanterns casting long shadows on the path ahead. They spoke little, but their silence was not one of discomfort. It was a comfortable, peaceful silence, one that spoke of shared understanding and mutual respect. They had both been changed by this journey, by the lessons they had learned, and by the bond that had grown between them. When they entered the castle, the princess's heart felt lighter than it had in a long time. The prince no longer felt like a stranger in the palace. He felt like someone who belonged there, someone who had earned a place not through titles or status, but through kindness, integrity, and love. The royal family, seeing the prince in his true form, welcomed him with open arms. The courtiers, who had once whispered and doubted, now saw him as a figure of wisdom and grace, someone who had proven that true nobility was not measured by wealth or position, but by the strength of one's character. The days that followed were filled with joy and celebration. The princess and the prince spent their time learning from each other, growing together, and discovering the beauty of what it meant to love and be loved in return. They became not just companions, but true partners, working side by side to bring peace, kindness, and wisdom to the kingdom. In time, the prince and the princess were married, and their love story became one of legend. It was a story not of magic and curses, but of two souls who had found each other through honor, kindness, and a shared commitment to doing what was right, no matter how difficult or strange it seemed. Their union brought about a new era of peace and prosperity in the kingdom, where love, integrity, and the power of keeping one's word were held in the highest regard. And so, the princess, who had once been uncertain and afraid, found her place in the world, not as a princess bound by the expectations of others, but as a queen who ruled with wisdom, compassion, and a heart that was true. The prince, who had once been trapped in the form of a frog, found freedom not just in the breaking of a curse, but in the love and kindness that had brought him back to his true self. Together, they ruled the kingdom with grace and wisdom, always remembering that the greatest magic in the world came from the purity of the heart and the courage to be kind, no matter the challenges one faced. And they lived happily ever after, as true partners in every sense of the word. That's the story of the Frog Prince. Hopefully this story can help you sleep. Good night.